Dear students, in our continuing discussion on the topic, the making of the global world, today we are going to have our third session, which is going to cover a very important dimension of our discussion, that is on the 20th century. As you all know, two events of great magnitude defined the 20th century world. These were the two world wars which were fought just with a gap of only 20 years from one another. But the wider consequences of these wars demonstrated how integrated the world economy had become by this time, and how an unlikely event in one part of the world had its ripple effects on its other parts, almost as a matter of course, affecting entire economies, societies, as well as individual lives. This can be understood from two wider instances. The first is the kind of economy the world experienced between the two world wars, and the second is the kind of shape the world economy took after the Second World War. Now, before we understand the first instance, we need to also understand the nature and implications of the First World War. This was a war which involved the world's leading industrial nations of the time, with Britain, France and Russia on the one side. They were known as the Allies, and Germany, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Turkey on the other side, and they were known as the Central Powers, with an objective to inflict unprecedented levels of casualties on their adversaries and win the war in the shortest possible time. These powers not only exploited the vast potential of modern industry to manufacture and use weapons of mass killing, such as the machine guns, tanks, aircrafts and chemical weapons, but they also recruited millions of soldiers from around the world and moved them to the numerous battlefronts in Europe. Obviously, for this to be done, they required large ships and trains. Consequently, not only the industries there were restructured to produce mainly war-related goods, but entire societies were also reorganized. The point to be noted is, now women were stepping in to do the jobs that were earlier being performed by men, as the men went to battle. Besides, the usual economic links between the warring nations in Europe were also getting snapped. So this was leading the United States of America, which obviously and ultimately joined the war in support of the Allies, to emerge as the new economic powerhouse of the world. This happened precisely because Britain and others started borrowing huge sums of money from the American banks as well as from the American public. As against the expectation of most people at that time, it was the general impression that the war will be over in 4 to 5 months' time. That is, all of you know, the war started in the month of August, and they felt by the Christmas of that year, that is 1914, the war will come to an end. But as against all such expectation and hopes, it lasted for more than 4 years. And in its trail, it left almost 9 million people dead and 20 million people injured in the entire process. Most of these people were either killed or injured were in their working age. Thus, as the war got over, not only the workforce in Europe came down drastically, but with fewer working members now available in households across the continent. the incomes also declined very substantially. During the war, a large increase in demand, production and employment had led to an economic boom. As you all know, when a nation prepares for war, it requires a whole lot of things in order to support its men fighting on the front. And this is precisely what had happened during the war. Now, as the wartime demand came to an end and governments brought down expenditures to the level of peacetime, production obviously came down and unemployment also increased. The factories were no longer working in multiple shifts. Hence, the factories did not require that many number of people to work for them. So, this was one of the reasons why unemployment increased. Eastern Europe, which was a major supplier of wheat before the war started, now saw a revival in its production, creating a surplus in the world market, because in the meantime, countries like Canada, America and Australia had expanded their wheat production dramatically. As I have already pointed out, during the war, Europe almost had got vertically split, and hence the economic links had been snapped, and that is why the wheat produced in eastern part of the continent was finding it difficult to come to the western part, and hence this snapping of the trade links. Now, as a result of this, grain prices came down drastically in the whole continent, and it led to a sharp decline in rural income. And because of this, farmers fell deeper into some kind of debt trap. In contrast to this depressing situation in Europe, the United States saw a spectacular growth in its economy a little after the conclusion of the war. This growth came because of a few things. First, it came riding on the back of a mass production of industrial goods such as cars, refrigerators, washing machines, radios, gramophone players, etc. These were goods which was giving that extra tinge to the affluent lifestyle in the United States of America. And hence, there was a big rat race in order to possess these articles, because they would now define the standing of a family in the social scale. The second factor was large scale investment in construction activities such as houses, offices, public works, etc. Why was it important? It was important precisely because the state was trying to display its newly acquired economic status in the world, and hence there was a need in order to have these kinds of infrastructure. Besides, there was a huge demand, and the banks in the country and other agencies which had the surplus capital now were creating conditions for greater consumerism. Say, for example, a kind of system which came into existence was the system of hire purchase. This enabled buying of goods on hire, or in other words on credit, which had to be repaid substantially subsequently in installments. And the resumption of overseas lending by 1923 on the part of the United States of America also increased substantially, which boosted European recovery. However, this fairy tale story of economic boom in the United States of America did not last long. it was busted in 1929, which plunged the entire world economy into something that we all now know as the Great Depression. And this situation of economic crisis across the world continued till mid 1930s, and it again demonstrated, if for anything that we are concerned here with, to the extent the world economy had come to be integrated by now. The exact timing and impact of the Great Depression varied from country to country, but in general, the regions that were most affected were the agricultural regions, and the communities who were most affected were the ones which depended on agriculture. The basic economic situation which we have to understand here is, how did it happen? As I have already said, there is a cycle of overproduction. In Eastern Europe, for example, people started producing more, and now the other countries which had chipped in during the course of the war, they were also beginning to produce more, and so it led to a fall in prices. And a fall in prices in the market would obviously lead to a decline in agricultural incomes. And a decline in agricultural incomes would create some kind of anxieties among the farming communities. What would they do? They would increase production in order to maintain some kind of a balance in their overall income. So that will lead to further fall in prices. And so this vicious cycle ultimately led to the crash of the agricultural market, not only in Europe or in the United States of America, but worldwide. With this slump, even in the beginning years after the conclusion of the war, coming into sight, the United States overseas lending agencies stopped giving further credit, mostly to the European countries, whose economic recovery depended upon such credits. So this plunged the whole continent into some kind of an economic crisis. It led to the failure of some major banks also in Europe. There were currencies which entirely collapsed. Even major currencies such as the British pound and sterling also found itself on the verge of collapsing. In Latin America and elsewhere, it led to a dramatic fall in agricultural and raw material prices. These were the countries, as you would know, were sustaining their economies on the strength of their exports of raw materials and agricultural produce to the developed markets in the United States of America or in Europe. Inside USA, now with falling prices, banks slashed domestic lending. I have already told you how, with the new scheme of buying goods on credit, which were liberally lent by the banks there, the economy was booming. Now the banks started stopping domestic lending, and whatever loans they had sanctioned earlier to people, with which they had gone out and bought all the consumer durables and also houses, etc., for themselves, those credits were being called back by the banks. This led to a collapse of businesses, loss of employment, distress, sale of homes, cars, and other consumer durables by the people. And yet, non-recovery of loans and collapse of the banking system itself was creating a huge problem for the country. The loans could not be recovered, and the banks were finding themselves collapsing by the day. And where was India in all this? India saw a decline in its imports and exports by almost half during this period of great economic crisis. Peasants producing crops for the world market were the worst hit. And who are these peasants who are producing good agricultural goods for the world market? As I have already said in my previous sessions, the wheat farmers of Punjab or the jute farmers of Bengal, or even the plantations where tea used to be produced, they all suffered hugely. Particularly, prices of wheat and jute almost came down by 50%. But as a matter of great sadness, and as it used to happen with all alien governments, the colonial government in India refused to relax revenue payments. This drove the farmers into severe debt traps. The story of jute growers even was worse than the wheat growers. Those who had borrowed in advance, hoping for a better time, fell far deeper into debt as they had to sell their produce almost a throwaway price. Thus, with rural India simmering with discontent, it was time for the civil disobedience movement to be launched. And in urban areas, what was the situation? In urban areas, people who were mostly salaried, who had fixed incomes, people who had built houses and had given them out on rent, they found their incomes coming steadily, and hence life becoming easier for them, with everything now costing less. Industrial investment also grew as the government extended tariff protection to industries coming under the pressure of the nationalist opinion. Now, look at the second instance. See how the world economy was reintegrated in the aftermath of the Second World War. And this was again a war which was fought over a long period of time, almost 6 years. This was again some kind of a war which split the world vertically. On the one side, you had the Axis power consisting of Germany, Japan and Italy. On the other side, you have Britain, France, the Soviet Union and the United States of America. As I said, this war continued for 6 long years, and in its trail left almost 60 million people dead, directly or indirectly. And for your information, in both these world wars, India also lost so many people, many of them recruited to fight the European war on their fronts, because India was a colony at the time. Now, coming to our main theme, if anything, the severe consequences of at least the Second World War now taught the whole world to be wary of leaving everything in the hands of the market. There was also an urgent need of reconstruction, ensuring economic stability and full employment in the industrial world. Why in the industrial world? Because it is the industrial world of the time which was in the vanguard of economic prosperity of the whole world, as it were, which had suffered the most. It had almost been devastated by the new weapons of mass killing which were used extensively by the warring parties. And it were with these aims now in mind that the International Monetary Fund and what we now know as the World Bank were instituted. The International Monetary Fund was set up to deal with the external surpluses and deficits of its member nations, and the World Bank, the proper name of which was the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, came to be set up in order to finance the war reconstruction around the world. In the United States of America, and the state where it was held was New Hampshire, and this conference was held even as the world was in the midst of the war. So, it was held in the month of July 1944. These Bretton Woods institutions now tried to put in place an international monetary system whereby national currencies got linked to each other on the basis of a fixed exchange rate. The dollar became the new standard because it remained tightly wedded to the value of gold. However, for a certain period, the Bretton Woods system ensured an era of unprecedented growth of trade and incomes for the Western industrial nations and Japan. It saw a worldwide spread of technology and enterprise, as the former Western colonies, now becoming free nations after the end of the Second World War, tried to seek help from those very colonial masters to come out of their poverty and underdevelopment. This also encouraged the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to shift their attention towards the needs of these countries from the 1950s onwards. Besides, there were the large multinational corporations, which we know simply by their abbreviation, that is MNCs. These multinational corporations, which originated in countries such as the United States, and of course, they originated mostly in the United States at that point in time, they also came in to secure rights to exploit the natural resources of these countries very cheaply, against their promise to set up industries, do mining, and provide employment to the people in those newly freed countries. However, from the 1960s onwards, things began to change. The changing environment provided the world economy a qualitatively different direction. The United States dollar could not maintain its position as the world's principal currency because it failed to maintain a fixed ratio in its value to the gold. Consequently, the earlier Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rate was changed into a system of what came to be known as the floating exchange rates. And what is floating exchange rate? Floating exchange rate, you would all know, even today, the Indian rupee would have some value against the US dollar today, and it might change after a few days. So, this is what you call the floating exchange rate. Why does it happen so? It happens because of various factors, but it happens mostly how the value of a currency is fixed as against the value of the standard currency, in this case the US dollar. From the mid 1970s onwards, the developing countries also found themselves forced to borrow money from Western commercial banks and private lending institutions. You may ask why? Because most of these Western industrialized economies were market centric economies, and hence it would not be their governments who would be the first and the primary agencies to give out credits. Hence, they would all encourage countries seeking credit to approach the market. And hence, after some time, when it was felt that the economy was slowly getting back onto its feet worldwide, and the reconstruction activities were coming to some kind of an end, with durable gains coming into the hands of different countries. So, they encouraged the developing countries to go and approach their commercial institutions for the credit. So, this pushed the developing countries into periodic debt crisis. Thus, a movement among these countries brought such organizations as the Group 77 into fore. The primary objective of having these institutions in place was to play a new kind of political and economic role in the new world. They wanted to have a new international economic order, where they can have a few things. The first thing which they wanted to have was to have some kind of a real control over their natural resources, because they did not have much else. The second thing which they wanted was to have fairer prices for their raw materials. Earlier, in their anxiety to get technology from the developing countries, which were the earlier colonial past, they were trying to butter their raw materials at a very cheap price, but now they felt it is time to ask for a fair deal. Now, the third thing which they wanted was also some kind of development assistance from the developed world based on mutual respect, and the credit to come to them without much of conditionalities. So, these were certain things which they wanted to have, and in order to have these, they required some political groupings, because without groupings in modern democratic system, you cannot have enough pressure on the few developed countries which had the upper hand in economic deals. From the late 1970s onwards, the multinational corporations also started understanding the flows of the world economy, and hence they started shifting their production operations to low wage Asian countries such as China. This stimulated world trade and capital flows, introducing rapid economic transformation of the world, and that is the world which we today know by the name of globalization. Thus, we come to the end of our discussion of the topic, the making of the global world. So, as I said, we had 3 sessions. In the first session, we wanted to understand whether the process of globalization is entirely new, or whether some rudimentary form of globalization in the pre-modern times. And we saw it from examples beginning with our own country, the Indus Valley civilization, how the civilized world even in those olden days was somehow linked to each other. It is said that we cannot exist in isolation, because we cannot produce everything that we want, and our wants are not limited, and hence there was some kind of a process of globalization even in those times. Now, that process of globalization underwent substantial qualitative changes in the medieval times, and we saw how it happened. And then we saw how the process started becoming slightly different with the coming of the Industrial Revolution in Europe particularly. It led to colonialism, it led to imperialism, and it also led to some kind of an economic integration from which one could not get out. And that process of globalization has received some kind of a respectability because of a new framework, which we now understand as the new international economic order. And that is the globalization that we are celebrating today. Thank you.